I was raised on what I thought was my dad's ranch. My grandparents, Bess and Steve Trigg Sr., bought our New Mexico ranch 100 years ago in 1918. My grandfather died before I was born, and my grandmother died while I was in high school, so as far as I knew, Dad owned it. But of course my dad's two sisters owned the ranch as well. And when my aunts and my dad passed, the ranch would have been owned by the 7 of us in the 3rd generation. From there, ownership would be spread amongst the next generations. With rising land prices, the land is worth more money if it's sold than the money it can generate. How long would it be before family members would want to sell their share? Most of us in the 3rd generation had developed our own lives away from the ranch, but how could we put a price on owning such a vast piece of land that is so remote there's no cell phone service and the stars are brighter than you have ever imagined? So when my brother Steve, the 3rd Steve Trigg, said that he didn't want a part of the ranch, he wanted the whole thing, we started a conversation. All of us in the 3rd generation decided we wanted to keep the ranch together. And so in the late 90s, with Dad's blessing, we'd started to investigate how we could do just that. The 3rd generation decided what we wanted. The ranch to stay as a single ranch, for it to be owned equally by all Trigg heirs. All ranch profits should go back into the ranch, and if not, then to charity. And for it not to be sold unless 85% of the heirs agreed, and a Trigg descendant, if possible, would manage the ranch. My sister Sally, a lawyer, set out to find an estate lawyer to help set up our vision. She interviewed many before she found one in Albuquerque that was willing and in fact enthusiastic about our project. Even though the ranch is in New Mexico, we set up a South Dakota trust because South Dakota has no rule against perpetuity. In other words, the ranch could last forever. Our accountant was sure that we were all crazy. After years of gifting our shares of the ranch to the Bess, Steve and Bess Trigg Trust, the trust now owns the ranch and the descendants own the trust, and it can't be sold unless 85% of the heirs agree to do so. My dad, Steve Trigg Jr., ran the ranch for most of his adult life. Dad was honest, kind, generous, and well-respected. He supported Dodge and Ford, the pet magazine industry, and he taught us all how to drive trucks, tractors, and airplanes. And he spoke with the language most colorful. Some years ago, a neighbor, Jim Payne, told me he and a visiting friend met Dad driving along the road. They stopped and had a brief conversation. Upon continuing their drive, Jim's friend commented that Dad must be the most religious man that he had ever met. Somewhat taken aback, Jim asked, "How'd you figure that?" His friend replied, "Well, Dad used God's name to punctuate every sentence." But Dad didn't share his decisions, plans, or finances with any of us. When he died in 2002, none of us really knew what shape the ranch was in. Dad had almost doubled the size of the ranch in the 50s after much of the ranch had been lost and sold from the 20s through the Great Depression. So he'd done a great job of adding land, but the land was now overstocked and the land degraded, and we didn't know how many cattle we had. Dad hadn't known either. Years earlier, when the accountant pressured him for the number of cattle he had, Dad showed up in our office with 6 feet of aerial photo, and he said, "You count them, they're all there." Fortunately for us, Dad hated to spend money. When he died, we were all relieved to find the ranch was debt-free, and there was even some money in the bank. My sister Kristen and brother-in-law Rick had lived on the ranch as ranch hands since the early 80s, so with Dad's passing, the first thing we did was to appoint Kristen as the ranch manager. Overnight, she went from ranch hand with no authority to the boss. It was very stressful for her. One of Kristen's early goals was to rid the ranch of 30 years of neglected wild feral cattle. The ranch is 50,000 acres, lying in a very remote and rugged part of New Mexico. A dirt road named Trigg Road traverses the land and spans 51 miles from Logan to Mosquero, the two closest towns. Until I was in high school, Mosquero, 17 miles away, was the closest telephone, and pastures averaged over 6,000 acres. Since grandfather Steve Sr. first brought the first herd of cattle from the XIT ranch in Texas in 1917, many of the descendants of those cattle had lived their entire lives in the same pasture, avoiding the biennial gathers and begetting wild cattle. While the cattle we could gather had a good reputation with our cattle buyers, they also had a reputation for being somewhat wild. And of course, those were the tame ones. The wild ones would bolt and hide at even the slightest hint of human, so catching them wasn't easy. It took over 10 years of trickery, gathering, roping, helicopter gathering, and finally, just shooting the last ones out of a helicopter. There may still be a few left. The worst, over 1,200, were hauled to the sale ring. Kristen had about 600 cows left to work with. We began the journey from casual observer to ranch owner-operator. We developed a mission statement to operate the Trigg Ranch in a manner that is socially, or economically, financially, and socially sustainable so that all Steve and Bess Trigg descendants may enjoy the land's gifts, and to manage our lands to be healthy, diverse, productive, and naturally beautiful so that we Triggs may, in the words of Buck Ramsey in his poem Anthem, ever live in peace with her and dying come to rest with her. And we take our responsibility as caretakers of the land seriously. We are striving to improve the soil biology, mineral cycling, and water retention. Alan Savory teaches us that we can use our cattle to actually improve the land's health. The main way we do this is by concentrated rotational grazing. But rotational grazing is easier said than done, especially with 6,000 acre pastures. The first thing you have to have is smaller pastures, and each pasture has to have water, and lots of it. To that end, Kristen, her daughter Caitlin, and sister Sally take advantage of any federal, state, local government, and private programs that provide monetary assistance as well as training and technical assistance. Without these programs, we've never been able to make the progress that we've had. We've built miles and miles of fences to reduce the pasture size. We've installed water systems to feed cattle drinkers. We've sprayed mesquite. We've masticated juniper trees. We've learned to harvest water from roads and reduce and even repair erosion. And now Kristen builds a pretty mean rolling dip in the ranch roads with her cat front end loader. We monitor the land for health. In 2003, Jim Howell, an educator from Alan Savory's ranch management course that Kristen and Rick attended, came out to show us how to set up monitoring transects and monitor the land health. We learned about litter and how to evaluate the land in detail. Since then, every fall, cousin Linda and her husband John, some dedicated friends, Kristen, Caitlin, and Sally, spend a week examining the 12 transects spread throughout the ranch. In 2003, a private carbon credit exchange was set up in the U.S. where a business that emits a large amount of carbon might buy offset carbon credits from a business that reduces carbon emissions. If a ranch could show that it was managing its land to store additional carbon in its rangeland soils, it could sell carbon credits on this exchange. As a direct result of our ranch management and land monitoring practice, we were the only ranch in New Mexico and one of the few in the United States that actually sold carbon credits through that exchange. This sale netted the ranch enough to buy a brand new F-250 diesel crew cab with all the bells and whistles, with enough left over to buy a 72-ounce steak at the Big Texan in Amarillo. And now we know how many cattle we have. We learned Bud Williams' low-stress cattle handling techniques, and now we can push the cattle from one pasture to another on foot, a four-wheeler, or a feed truck with no problem. And we keep the family involved. One way we do this is our annual family work week. 1 week every summer, we gather as many family and friends as we can for a big project. It started in 1998 specifically to restore Grandma Beth Trigg, or Nana as we call her, to restore Nana's house. This was of great interest, not only because of the sentimental value of the house, but to provide a place for the Trigg clan to stay when we visit. The house was seriously degraded from years of neglect. There was very little running water from the nearby spring. The piano was in serious jeopardy of falling through the living room floor. and the windows were falling apart, and the guest house bathroom was not only unusable, but there were literally 2 inches of mostly dead daddy long-legged spiders in the bottom. So the first 12 years of work weeks were spent fixing up the old rock house. Now Nana's house is a beautiful place to stay with a modern kitchen. Since then, we've concentrated work weeks on my dad's house after a few years of working on a Cowboy bunkhouse for Sister Sally and a house for niece Caitlin. After working hard during the day, we relax with a beverage and visit and eat. This has been a great way to get to know each other, and it gives everyone involved a sense of belonging to the ranch. And of course, one of the greatest legacies of ranching and ranch life is working with and branding cattle. Kristen recruits family and friends for hard work in the spring and fall to help gather and brand the new calves. The kids start out young, vaccinating and ear tagging and moving on to flanking as they get a little bit bigger. Kristen brands, Sean loves to heel, and Caitlin cuts. A year ago, we had a local policeman help brand, and after he watched Caitlin castrate about 50 cows, he looked at, or 50 calves, he looked at her and he said, "I will never look at you the same way again." So can the family ranch last more than a few generations? We believe that our perpetual trust solved the diluting ownership and financial burdens, and our management emphasis has changed. We've come to realize that we are not primarily a cattle ranch. What we really are is a grass ranch. It isn't cattle we raise, it's grass. Now more than 40 species. We just use cattle to get our grass to market. And so, with our trust in place and the family involved, we hope the Steve Trigg Ranch will stand the test of time. Thank you.